Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Today's guest is Dr. Magda Havas, and this program was actually filmed almost exactly 2 years ago in June of 2009. Dr. Havas is a professor from Trent University. She's a toxicologist, and she's talking about the issue of the electromagnetic radiation that now surrounds us all from all of the wireless stuff that exists. Electromagnetic radiation. Magda, what are the issues we're talking about here?
Well, we're talking about several issues. One of them is microwave radiation coming from wireless technology. Another is power quality that flows along the wires. A third is low-frequency electromagnetic energy associated with power lines and some electronic and electrical equipment. And the last is ground current that's a problem in certain areas.
Okay. So the first one you said is microwave and radio frequency radiation. Can you just tell us what that is in terms people can understand?
Sure. Well, you know, people use radios, they listen to the television, they watch TV, they use a cell phone, and all of that uses radio frequency radiation to get the message from an antenna to a receiver. And the receiver could be your television set or it could be your radio. In the past, we had very few stations that carried the signal, and now that we're using cell phones, there are more and more antennas being erected and more people using the technology. So we're basically sending this radiation through the air constantly.
So the things are, for example, if there's 10 radio stations in your community or city, all of them are beaming out a radiation in order to send out their message. Is that what we're talking about?
That's correct. And you know, the radio station call sign, their station is the frequency that they're using to send the information.
So for example, here in Victoria we have 1070, which is CFAX. So they're beaming on that radiation frequency?
Exactly.
Is that what it is?
That's
okay.
right.
Is that harmful to us in any way, aside from politically?
Well, if we have very little radiation, you know, that's the better. We weren't brought up with this form of radiation. We just started using it when radio was first invented, and we've added more and more frequencies to it. And I think that's the problem. It's not that, though, you know, a little bit of radiation is probably okay, but if you start having more and more and more and more, then eventually people who are sensitive to this can't tolerate the radiation exposure.
And there's AM stations and FM stations. Is
Correct.
one better or worse than the other in terms of radiation?
Well, an AM station has a lower frequency than an FM station, and we don't know enough about it as to whether that's harmful. We're less concerned about radios unless the antennas are within a community. We're more concerned about cell phone antennas because they're popping up absolutely everywhere. We're concerned about Wi-Fi antennas because they're popping up everywhere. And the more antennas you have, the more exposure you have.
Okay. Where we are now is in Triangle Mountain in Victoria. And we're doing this interview in a home, and there is a very, very large tower outside that has, I know, FM radio on it and a lot of cell phone transmitters as well. Can you tell us something about all of that in relation to the homes that are all around here?
Well, the problem with that particular antenna or tower is that it's far too close to homes. There are homes at the base of it, there's homes all around it. The people who live in this community have become ill. They have a variety of symptoms, from cancers to chronic fatigue to sleep disorders. And many of the symptoms that they're experiencing are the ones that we have labeled electrohypersensitivity. And the symptoms of electrohypersensitivity could very easily be called rapid aging syndrome because it feels as though you're a lot older than your chronological years. And that's one of the ways the people explain away their symptoms. They have chronic back pain, they have headaches that they never used to have before. And they say, well, I'm just getting older, and so this is perfectly normal. The thing is, when they go into a clean environment, those symptoms disappear. And if it was really due to aging, then they wouldn't disappear, they'd be chronic illnesses.
So what you're saying is that exposure to these towers, which are so close to the homes, is a health concern?
Very much so.
On what basis do you say that? What's your background in this field?
Well, one of the bases I use is that we've actually measured the radiation in this house and exceeded the federal guidelines. So that's a real concern.
And the federal guidelines are not low.
And the federal guidelines are
very high.
not low, and they're not even protective. So the fact that the levels have gone up beyond the federal guidelines is very disturbing. Industry Canada should be out here basically reducing the radiation from the antennas so that they're not exceeding the guidelines. But even without those guidelines, other countries use much lower guidelines, and the question is why? And the answer is that our federal guidelines are based on a heating effect. The assumption is if the radiation does not heat your body, it's assumed to be safe. And that was a fair assumption, 40, 50 years ago when we didn't have the science. It's no longer a fair assumption because the science is showing us that we're having non-thermal effects, non-heating effects that are adversely affecting the lives of people who live near these antennas.
So Health Canada or Canadian safety standards, now this is microwave radiation, right? That's what we're talking about.
It's no. From the FM radio, it's lower than microwave.
From the cell phone?
But it's high rate. From cell phones, it's microwave. Microwave radiation is high frequency, radio frequency radiation. So that's one of the ways to sort of think about it.
And so Health Canada says if it doesn't have the effect of being inside a microwave oven where you're being actually warmed up, there is no effect from this microwave radiation
That's
or
correct.
any other. And you're saying that there is an effect at much lower levels than being actually heated.
Exactly. Studies have shown damage to DNA, which is a precursor for cancer. Studies have shown changes in the blood-brain barrier, which becomes much more permeable, so things can get into your brain that normally would be kept out. There's enzymes that are affected that are absolutely fundamental for healthy functioning of the body. There's movement of calcium between cells that have been affected, and all sorts of studies documented around the world. And Health Canada is choosing to ignore these studies.
Now, I live in a part of town that isn't close to too many of these cell phone towers, but, and I don't have a cell phone, but I know that anybody who does have a cell phone, you're always in contact with every other cell phone in the world, which means that the radiation is everywhere that I am. There's always that radiation. Is that an issue like secondhand smoke from tobacco smokers?
Very much so. If you're in the same room with someone using a cell phone, you're exposed to a certain amount of that radiation. Obviously, the person using the phone is exposed to the highest level because it's coming from the antenna, but it has to communicate with another antenna, and hence that radiation is going through the air, and it goes in all directions. There's an omnidirectional antenna at the top of a cell phone, so because it doesn't know which way the antenna is, so it has to go in all directions. So anyone who's close to anyone using a cell phone, anyone who lives in a community where there are cell phone antennas is being exposed to the levels of radiation that are lower, but not necessarily harmless.
But even if I'm not in a room with somebody using a cell phone, the cell phone radiation must be there from the tower. That's because if I have a cell phone and somebody phones me, my cell phone will ring, which means that radiation is coming
through the walls and everything else. That's
24
right.
hours a day.
Possibly 24 hours a day. In built-up communities, definitely 24 hours a day. If you go out to rural regions where the population density is lower, it wouldn't be on a 24-hour basis.
Can you just tell us on what basis you have an expertise in this field? Have you written or?
Well, I have, yes. When I first started doing research, it was in chemical toxicology, and I was interested in what chemicals are toxic to organisms in the environment. And I looked at I did research in air quality, water quality, metal pollution, that type of thing. And in the early 1990s, I became interested in electromagnetic energy purely out of curiosity, and partly because I wanted to teach about it in a course I was teaching called Pollution Ecology. And as I began to learn more, I realized that this radiation was dangerous, and there was relatively little research being done. It was something that was politically not an attractive area to do research in, because there's a lot of industries who rely on this radiation and certainly don't want the information to get out. And I just began to work with people who are electrically sensitive, and we're coming up with the most amazing results with people who are diabetic, for example. It affects their blood sugar. We've worked with people who have multiple sclerosis, and it affects their symptoms. Their symptoms become worse when they're exposed. Similarly, if we clean up their environment, their symptoms disappear. So, I think a lot of the illnesses that we're experiencing in society today, whether it's attention deficit disorder, asthma, some of the cancers, are directly linked to this form of radiation.
That's quite a remarkable statement, because it's the kind of thing I would say, absolutely never hear about anywhere in our media, which of course is, a lot of it is radiation based, so we don't expect to see this on TV. But maybe you can just say a little bit more, maybe give some examples of people you've dealt with.
Well, we've worked with diabetics, and when I found out diabetics were sensitive to this energy, I became quite intrigued, because we can measure blood sugar in a very objective manner. Blood sugar is not something that you can control consciously. And one of the women we worked with was an 80-year-old who had type 1 diabetes, which meant that she took insulin twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, after measuring her blood sugar. And we put filters in her home and measured her blood sugar before and after the filters went in, that clean up dirty electricity or improve power quality in the home.
So the filters are there to make the radiation in her home less?
Exactly.
Okay.
They reduce the radiation. The levels were reduced, and her blood sugar dropped from an average of, I'm trying to remember the numbers, about 9.7 down to about 6.8. 7 is the level that it should be below if you're a diabetic. When you wake up in the morning, this is fasting plasma glucose, or the first blood sugar that you measure in the morning. And one of the interesting things with her, she would measure her blood sugar in the evening as well. Whenever she went out of the house, I could tell if she was away from the house, because her blood sugar would spike. And the two things this 80-year-old liked to do was go shopping and gambling. And so whenever she went to the casino or whenever she went shopping, she would come back with very high blood sugar levels. And we think that's because she was in a dirty environment. The amount of insulin she took with and without the filter, so in a dirty versus a clean environment, dropped from 36 units a day to 9 units a day. She just didn't need the insulin because her blood sugar was fairly low. How many diabetics could reduce the amount of insulin they take if they cleaned up their environment, the environment they're living in? We worked with another person who was a type 2 diabetic. She controlled her blood sugar by exercise and by eating properly. And so whenever her blood sugar went up, she would simply go for a 20-minute walk and it would come right back down to normal. If she worked out on a treadmill, her blood sugar actually went up rather than down. And the reason for that is treadmills produce dirty electricity, so they're actually contributing to the electrosmog in her environment. And we think this can actually be used as a diagnostic by doctors who have patients who are diabetic. Simply put them on a treadmill, measure their blood sugar before and after, and find out if it goes up and down. If it goes down, they're purely diabetic, they don't have electrical sensitivity. If it goes up, they have electrical sensitivity, and hence by controlling their environment, they can control their blood sugar.
It's quite remarkable. So there is seemingly a connection then between people with diabetes and electromagnetic radiation.
That's right. Some people with diabetes and electromagnetic radiation. That's right. And we find changes within 20 minutes. So within 20 minutes, your blood sugar will go up and down depending on the environment that you're in.
Now, you mentioned attention deficit, ADHD. I don't even know what ADHD means.
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right?
Now, that's mostly in children, and children are probably more sensitive to this kind of radiation. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, we did a study at a school in Minnesota and another school in Toronto, and we found that when we cleaned up the school environment, symptoms of young children improved, their behavior improved. And it was primarily in elementary schools, to a certain degree in middle schools, but very little improvement in high schools. And the symptoms that seemed to go away when we cleaned up the environment in the school was the symptoms that we associate with hyperactivity disorder. And so we think that there's actually a connection between the two. The number of young people who are diagnosed with this is increasing exponentially, and they're being drugged in order to, appear normal to everyone else. But I think if we just cleaned up their electromagnetic environment, they wouldn't have the symptoms in the first place and wouldn't need any of the medication.
Now, we've been talking, how about when somebody uses a cell phone, which virtually everybody does? What are the dangers? What are the impacts?
Well, if you use a cell phone, one of the most recent studies that just came out this year is that if you use a cell phone for more than 10 years, you have an increased risk of developing either a brain tumor, a tumor that affects the nerve going to your ear, or a tumor that affects the gland, or a tumor that affects the salivary gland on the same side of the head that you use the cell phone. So there's an increased risk in one of those types of tumors if you use it for more than 10 years. And that is very disturbing. There's also data that shows that it will affect your brainwave activity, and even after you stop using the phone, your brainwaves are disordered as a result of this. We know that one of the symptoms of this kind of sensitivity is that people develop headaches. Eventually they can't use a cell phone, and some people can't be in the same room with someone else using a cell phone because they've become so sensitized to the radiation.
Now, I assume some people are much more sensitive to this than others. Can you comment on that?
Well, the symptoms of sensitivity vary from severe, and these people cannot live in our modern society. They very often go into the country. A lot of them come to British Columbia and go out on one of the islands where there's relatively little radiation. They become quite ill. As a matter of fact, last night when we gave the talk, there was one woman who collapsed in her chair and had to leave because she couldn't tolerate the radiation. And that's a severe example. And anywhere from maybe 3 to 5% of the population has severe sensitivity like this.
3 to 5% have severe sensitivity?
Correct. Other estimates, that's my estimate of it. Other people will tell you it's actually much higher than that, but I think that's a good conservative estimate.
Well, that's a large number of people. I mean, that's 1 in 20 to 1 in 30 people. And yet I've never heard really what happens to these people. How do they live their lives in modern society, or do they have to go off and disappear?
Well, they clean up their own environment so they can live within their homes, provided that a cell tower doesn't move into their neighborhood, and then that becomes a problem. Very often they simply leave society. They become electromagnetic refugees, and they go out into the country and then set up a comfortable lifestyle where they can survive. And they're okay unless an antenna comes into their neighborhood, and then they have to move somewhere else. So it's really an absolutely horrific life for these individuals. I know people who can't go on vacations anymore because they can't get to their favorite spot, and once they get there, the hotels have wireless. So the fact that we're going wireless everywhere is a real tragedy for these people. It really limits their mobility. And while I'm very concerned about this 3 to 5%, there's about 35% of the population who has the symptoms of electrical sensitivity. They may or may not realize they're electrically sensitive, but they get very tired during the day. They just don't have the energy they used to have. They sleep poorly. They can't think as clearly. Their short-term memory begins to go. Some develop skin problems. Others have a ringing in the ear that's incredibly irritating. So they develop all sorts of different symptoms, and their lives are impaired. Their quality of life has been significantly impaired. They may or may not attribute it to electromagnetic exposure. And if they go into a clean environment, away from everything, these symptoms go away. They can sleep well, they have a lot more energy, their pain goes away, and then they go back to their normal working environment or home environment, and the symptoms come back again. So they're really living an impaired quality of life.
It's absolutely amazing that millions of people are being impacted, and yet it's kept completely secret within the media, I would say, and nothing is done. I mean, these companies can come and put up cell phone towers where they wish and irradiate us willy-nilly.
Exactly, and the government is on side helping them do that. They're not enforcing the guidelines. They haven't come here, to find out why there's a problem. There are other communities where this is a problem. If you contact Industry Canada and you ask them what the levels of radiation are, they can't tell you because they don't go out to do the measurements. They rely on the distributor, the wireless industry, to tell them how much they're going to radiate. And as long as the industry says we're below the guidelines, then it's fine by Industry Canada. However, if you have one tower and you have multiple antennas, the fact that individual antennas are below the guidelines doesn't mean that all of the antennas cumulatively will be below the guidelines. So Industry Canada is really reneging on its contract with the Canadian people by not doing its research properly. They're also collecting millions, if not billions of dollars in fees for the licenses for these antennas. So there's a real conflict of interest If you're making money, then how are you going to regulate the industry and restrict their distribution?
So just to be very clear, who is our government working for on this issue? Is it working for the citizens of this country, or is it working for the corporations?
Oh, it's very clear. They're working for the corporations. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I went to a meeting in Simcoe, Ontario, and there was a very large group there concerned about a cell phone antenna. And the minute some of the people representing Health Canada and Industry Canada came in with Rogers, you know, it was sort of 6 men in suits and ties who came in together, sat together, basically had the same line, and the rest of the people there were trying to protect their health, and there was really no one on their side.
Is there one other issue you'd like to talk about? We've sort of focused on,
Right.
I guess, cell phones and cell phone radiation and symptoms. Is there somewhere else you'd like to go with this?
Yeah, there's one thing that I think is incredibly important for people to know, and that is energy-efficient light bulbs are making people sick.
You're talking about what are they called?
Compact fluorescent light bulbs.
lights.
They're the ones, the curly Q light bulbs.
The ones that we're being told we have to use as of 2012 because the old incandescent bulbs are going to be phased out in Canada.
That's correct.
They're making people sick.
They're making people sick. There are 3 groups in the UK who have come out against them. The British Dermatological Association, Migraine Action, and Epilepsy Action. Migraine sufferers can't be exposed to these lights because it brings on a migraine. People with skin problems, they develop skin rashes, irritations, itchy skin, all sorts of problems. And for a lot of other people, they develop headaches, and they simply can't be in a room where you have these compact fluorescent light bulbs. As a matter of fact, if you ask people to remove these light bulbs from their home for a week and ask them to monitor their symptoms, whatever they are, whether they have difficulty sleeping or they have pain or headaches, by and large, many of them say, I feel so much better now that they're gone. Ask them to put them back in and they'll say, no, thank you, I don't want to expose my body to this form of energy. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the government to either ban these light bulbs. They contain mercury. They're a toxin. If you break the bulb in your home, it creates mercury pollution. Mercury is extremely toxic, a neurotoxin, and we don't want to put it into the environment, and that's basically what's happening because most people take their bulbs and throw them out at the dump. So we have a mercury problem, we have a radiation problem, and we have the fact that it's making people sick.
Just as an aside, I was listening to the radio a couple of days ago, and they were talking, they had a guest on who had looked into what, I'm not sure if it was Health Canada, but one arm of government said you're supposed to do if you accidentally break one of these compact fluorescent lights. And what you're supposed to do is leave the room and ventilate the room for 15 minutes before you come back in.
That's right.
And I guess that's because there's mercury in the air.
Exactly, and it just vaporizes, so it gets into the air. Imagine breaking one of these in a school environment. And the tube fluorescents also contain mercury, so how many of them have broken and simply been thrown out at the dump in polluted environments? It's absolutely amazing.
What about the role of the media in all of this? For example, in Britain a while back, I know some very prominent scientific organizations came out and said that children under the age of, I believe, 16 or whatever it was, should not be using cell phones. Now, this is a fairly strong statement coming from that group. It was given no coverage in Canada, and instead, here in Canada, children are being advertised and given. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting. Europe is at least 10 years ahead of us. The media is covering this almost on a daily basis. There are areas where they've removed wireless in libraries. They're taking wireless out of schools. There are all sorts of proclamations by a variety of countries, the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, China, Belgium, Finland, have all proclaimed that children should not use cell phones because it's damaging to their health. For an emergency, yes, but not as a regular phone to talk to their friends. And what happens in Canada? Virtually nothing. Certainly nothing from Health Canada.
And nothing from the media. We're not even told what these other countries are doing so that we don't know how to protect ourselves.
Exactly, exactly. The Toronto Board of Health, however, has come out very strongly saying children shouldn't use these cell phones. They think our guidelines should be reduced to 1/100th of what they are right now, but they have no jurisdiction because this is a federal issue and they're simply a city, concerned about the health of the people in their community.
So the person we're looking at then is Stephen Harper at the moment.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And prior to him, I guess Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. And this just keeps going along, getting worse, and no one does anything about it because, as we say, they work for the industry.
That's
Who are
right.
the corporations behind this? Who are the
Well, all of the wireless corporations. So TELUS, Rogers, all
Rogers,
of them.
Bell?
That's right. That's right. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and we're really up against giants who have money, power, the legal institutions on their side. So we're really fighting an uphill battle.
Thank you very much, Magda Havas. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, I just think it's really important to help people who have developed this electrical sensitivity. We need some wireless-free zones so that these people can actually survive in our communities. We need to protect children in schools. That's absolutely critical. And we need to keep these antennas away from communities so people can go on living without being affected by the radiation. And anything, anyone can do to help these individuals and help communities would be much appreciated.
Maybe one more thing. You mentioned Wi-Fi and how that is dangerous and how it's being taken out of many places in Europe and maybe the States as well. Can you just talk a little bit about where Wi-Fi is and what it's doing and how we can get rid of it?
Well, we're using Wi-Fi everywhere. It's a wireless technology that allows people to use their computers and go on the internet without directly hooking up. It's a wireless way of doing it. We have them in hotels, we have them at airports, we have them in coffee shops, we have them in schools now, increasingly in schools, and that's what concerns me the most. People have wireless routers in their homes. Some cities have gone wireless in the central core so that you can take your computer out and you can be sitting anywhere and getting this kind of convenience, which is wonderful, but at what cost? And if the cost is your health, I think we have to rethink the entire wireless revolution that we're going through.
One more thing. People have cordless phones in their home. Is that another problem?
There's two types of cordless phones. One of the phones, and this is becoming a very popular type of phone, is a DECT phone, D-E-C-T, and that stands for Digital European Cordless Telephony. This type of phone radiates from the base whether you're using the phone or not. So as soon as you plug in the base station, it's sending out radiation, and it sends it out at least 100 meters, so you can use your phone quite a distance from your house. And I really think this type of technology needs to be banned as well. Israel just last week banned it. They don't believe in these DECT phones or DECT baby monitors that would irradiate your baby, your infant.
Monitors.
That's right. And I've sent a letter to Health Canada asking them to ban it, and I haven't heard back from them. So I'm hoping that they'll have the courage to do something like that.
If you have a DECT phone, how do you know?
One way to tell if you don't have the appropriate equipment to measure it is to use a portable radio. One way to do it is to use a portable radio, and you simply turn it to an AM station and turn it slightly off station and bring it close to the base. So if you start hearing static, then you've got a DECT phone because it's interfering with the radiation.
And the other phone
you
will
won't
not.
hear anything.
Okay.
You won't hear
so
anything.
you take a Walkman radio, something
That's
like
right.
that, turn it slightly off the station.
At the low end of the AM scale.
The low end of the AM scale, bring it close to the phone, and if there's static, you probably have a DECT phone.
Exactly. It's the same thing when you're driving in your car. You have an AM station on and you go under a high voltage transmission line. There's that interference, and that's what you'll hear.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.